Good morning, good morning. I want to inform you that because this space is open to visitors and events like this, we welcome visitors. We want to ask you if you would wear masks in this place. My name is Kerry Rod and I am the Director of Events here at Carleton College. And I welcome you to this convocation. We stand on the homelands of the Wapekute and Metawakan bands of the Dakota Nation. We honor with gratitude the people who have stewarded the land through generations and their ongoing contributions to this region. We acknowledge the ongoing injustices that we have committed against the Dakota Nation, and we wish to interrupt this legacy, beginning with acts of healing and honest storytelling about the places we now call Carleton, Northfield, and Minnesota. The zianoiscat of the Carleton class of 2023 will introduce our guest speaker.
Waked, hook white up, zianoiscat ren squext, tesketskin wash equin, teshmakun wash equin. Oh shit, sorry. I am so sorry. I'll start again. Waked, hook white up, zianoiscat ren squext, tesketskin wash equin, teshmakun wash equin. Hello everyone, good morning. My name is zianoiscat. I am from the Canam Lake Band and Lillooet Nation. I'm a junior environmental studies major and I use she, her pronouns. So I'd first like to begin by inviting everyone to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, October 11th. Members of the Prairie Island Indian community will be here to set up a teepee on the Bald's Front from 2:30 to 4, and at 2:30 to 4:30. And from 4:30 to 5, there will be a talk on the patio between Bolio and CMC, focusing on local Indigenous history and archaeology. And following the talk, there will be a community dinner. I hope you can all join us in commemorating Indigenous histories and building community with the folks from Prairie Island. Today's convocation speaker is Anton Treuer, Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and editor of the Oshkaabewis Native Journal, the only academic journal in the Ojibwe language. While most people view English as America's native tongue, this assumption overlooks the hundreds of indigenous languages indigenous to the land before Europeans settled on it. Treuer, one of the growing number of language warriors fighting in the survival for the 150 remaining indigenous language in America, is leading a revitalized change to support the Ojibwe language. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world, speaking on topics such as indigenous language and culture, tribal sovereignty, cultural competence and equity, and strategies for addressing the achievement gap. A member of the Minnesota State Historical Society Governing Board, Treuer was named Guardian of the Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award for the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Today we will be learning from his most recent book, The Language Warrior's Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, which discusses the close-knit relationship between culture and language, how language loss happens, and how to fight it. Please welcome Anton Treuer to Carleton College.
Bonjour, minawa miigwech. Kawe animaji taya niwi Ojibwe majines. We wenigod winda munugo ge pichi miigwechi wenda man and enemigwan bajayan. Minawa damad uyan bangi in endaman dawajke. Ijichike angiban we wene. Deji kamangono in wewenan hepi tendamang. Minawa nanaga de wendamang dawajke. Ijichike ang we wene demino nisado tadium, demino dudadium. Ninda shwin wagosh indigu minawa migizin do dem wasawadio ishkonigan wenjabayan gazagaskwaji mekag nimin wendam dash bimiayayan umanongum. English too? They did ask me to come and speak, but they didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. No, I'm really excited to be here. People smarter, older, wiser than me, my elders say, when you meet new people, make sure that you hold up our Indigenous protocol, tell them your native name, your clan, where you're from. So I was giving you a brief introduction in my Ojibwe language. My native name is Wagush, which means fox, and I'm from the Eagle clan, and I come to you from Leech Lake, which is one of the Ojibwe reservations in northern Minnesota. I'm really excited to see you all today. We've been through, I think collectively as a nation, and here at Carleton, through quite an experience the past couple of years dealing with COVID. But it's not just that, I think these are testy times. Politics, race relations, climate change, there's a lot going on. And it is really, really important that we figure out how to get along. And instead of just, as humans have so often done, like water rushing down a mountain, following the gorges and paths of least resistance, that we think not just about following the paths, which don't always serve us well, sometimes they do, but how do we shape the flow to make things different, to make them better? And these are lofty but critical efforts that all of us really have a right, an ability, and a responsibility to engage in. So with our short time today, I thought I'd take you on a quick personal journey with regard to one of the hats that I wear, which is Indigenous language and culture revitalization. And I don't know if any of you have ever checked out the TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. If you haven't, it's certainly worth the 15 minutes of your time. But in there, among the great things that she says is that it's really dangerous if we take a single story narrative about any one group of people or even one human being and use it to make assumptions about that entire person or that entire group of people. The problem with stereotypes is not so much that they are incorrect as much as they are incomplete. One single story narrative about what it means to be white in America revolves around rural, impoverished Appalachia. And if that's all we look at and think, white people, man, the meth, it's terrible. And if we just looked at white people on New York's Upper East Side and thought, everything handed on a silver platter, wow. Neither single story narrative will tell you everything you need to know about what it means to be white in America. It's the same with us. One stereotype says we're all rich from casinos, and another says we're all living in squalor on reservations, and the truth is, it's kind of complex. In 16 Minnesota counties, tribes are not just big employers, they're the biggest employers of all. Better be nice to natives, you'll probably end up working for one someday. And at the same time, about 50% of native kids in America live below the poverty line. As human beings, we are all deeply motivated by many common needs. They include these: the need for connection, to find meaning in our lives. We crave these contradictory things: continuity, but also change. We're often at war with ourselves about those very things. And not the political definitions, but the actual linguistic definitions of conservatism and progressiveness and so forth revolve around just those things. The conservative idea is, well, it's important that we keep some of these things the same. And the progressive ideal is, we really need to change some of these things. I think every culture struggles with these things. I've kind of never met an elder from any culture who didn't shake his or her head and go, kids these days. Because there is a tension about cultural continuity and change for all of us. when we find these things genuinely, they can contribute to our personal happiness, the vibrancy and health of our society, our ability to get along with one another. And there are so many things that can get in the way. Death, substance abuse, even a divorce or a custody issue can threaten our connections to the things we hold most dear. We saw how a pandemic could threaten all kinds of things, from our very lives, to our ability to see our loved ones, to our freedoms to go where we want, when we want, how we want. And those things are stressful. As I've journeyed in my own life, I've been surprised so many times. I have been schooled by my little children. I have ascribed meaning to experiences and events in the world that weren't even there. Most of us, when we're talking to someone, the person we're talking to is not reacting to what we're saying or how we feel about it. They're reacting to something that happened in their life before they even met us. And whatever our words or sounds or smells or ideas might trigger in them about something that happened to them previously in their own lives. And so their reactions, it's not even about us or what we're trying to say. And it takes a high level of concentration to actually listen to someone else and to unburden our own experiences enough to truly connect and to truly listen. Things like colonization have revolved around someone coming in and saying, we know better than you what is best for you. And have come up with ideas like erasure, one language, one religion, one culture, one way of solving problems that most of the time made a whole bunch of other problems. Instead of listening or learning or being open to those other ideas and world views. My mother, who's pictured here with one of my sons, had passed away at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think for me, when I was a very young child, I have one brother who's a year younger than me. We kind of grew up almost like, Ojibwe twins, 9 months and 10 minutes apart. But we had, another brother and sister that came later on. I was actually 9 years old when they were born, and they actually were twins. But when I was really young, I kind of had my mom all to myself. And my brother and I did. And we were kind of, had humble means, but I think there was this acclamation to what is normal in terms of her time, attention, emotive presence that was turned on its head as both my brother and sister were born, and she went from stay-at-home mom to launching a legal career, and her time and attention was divided. And I had ascribed meaning to those things, that experience that just wasn't there. And it really wasn't until she was fighting for her life at the beginning of the pandemic that I really was able to put that into its proper perspective. That I didn't need her to attention me the way she had the first several years of my life. I just needed to know that she loved me that much all along. And she had. And it was so beautiful and peaceful and healing for both of us to come to terms with all of that. So, because there's no single story narrative, I'll give you a minute or two on me, because there's all kinds of surprises below the surface. For starters, my father's not Native at all. He's an Austrian Jewish immigrant, a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He has an amazing story, or I should really say, series of stories. It seems like he restarted his life many, many different times. And I'm happy when we get to questions to field some about the personal as well as the professional and kind of broader issue things that we'll be talking about today. But I'll suffice it to give you the short version of the story, which is that eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mother grew up in a little village called Bena in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400. Half of them are my cousins. And I think for her, things like harvesting wild rice was less a cool cultural pastime, and it was more a necessary means of survival. She only met one professional Native person her entire childhood. No police officers, no school teachers, no superintendents. There were no university administrators. There were no Indigenous bankers. No professional Native people everywhere except for one, and that was the school nurse. So she said, I could do that. And she finished high school and went on and got a nursing degree. And then she came back to the tribe and she ended up starting a tribal health program. And then she started dealing with all of this stuff, politics and economics, and she said, you know what, we need some lawyers. And she went on to become the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. For us, when I was little, you could say my dad was hitting the restart button and my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty, and I saw big changes. Used to have a little hand pump, kerosene lanterns. There was an outhouse. We washed up with enamel wash basins in the winter and washed up in the creek in the summer. But by the time I hit middle school, as my mother started her legal career, she built a nice house. The economic profile for our family changed. And to me, it revealed the power of an education. I feel like there's a lot of mythology about the American dream. It is half true. And the true part is what I saw my mom do, what I saw my dad do, and there's so many other stories like that in America. It is the most beautiful part about this truly wonderful country. And at the same time, I'm kind of with George Carlin. We call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. There are barriers out there, and those barriers are not equitably distributed by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, and by a whole host of other issues that intersect with all of our lives. I am a pretty unlikely candidate to have much to say about Indigenous languages, right? My grandmother, my mom's mom, who actually just passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 98. And she was born in a leap year, so she was like, I'm 24. And she had a point. But she had been brought to residential boarding school. And the US government ran a lot of boarding schools, but they were bringing so many natives into the schools, they couldn't build the schools or the staff fast enough, so they subcontracted a lot of the work to churches. And so churches ran a lot of the schools on behalf of the US government. In spite of our separation of church and state, there were forced conversions, harsh physical punishments for speaking the only languages that people knew. The schools kept cemeteries for the kids. And if you could imagine sending your kid to school and not getting a body back, or even having religious choice about the kind of send-off that your child would have, it was pretty harmful. Even now, we are struggling to come to terms with these sorts of things. And by the way, this is something that America has a lot of work to do. where we have a lot of work to do. Truth and reconciliation, that starts with truth. If you read the Desmond Tutu book, and he was deeply involved in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he identifies a simple to say, sometimes hard to do process for what reconciliation could look like. And he says the first thing is you have to tell the story. And sometimes you have to tell that story over and over again. You could insert Brene Brown and rewrite the story. And then you have to name the hurt. Say, hey, that was genocide. That was slavery. That was whatever it was. And then you can work on the forgiveness part and then decide, do we renew or release this relationship? It works at the individual level and it works at the national level. Some dude cheats on his wife, wants to reconcile the relationship. He's not going to get so far saying, forget about it, it all happened in the past. Guy's got to say sorry, mean it, be believed. It'll never happen again, mean it, be believed. And then he's got whatever chance when his partner decides to either renew or release that relationship. Here in America, we have a very hard time holding space for anyone to even tell the story. There's a lot of kind of shut up culture going on. What? You want to talk about race? Shut up. Can't do that in school. You know? We have this happening as we shout at each other over politics, culture, so many different things. And so my grandmother went to those schools, and as my mother grew up, even though she grew up in a native space and everyone was an avid hunter and wild rice harvester, and that part of the cultural toolbox was easier for her to access, things like our indigenous language, religious ceremonies, things like that, were maybe harder to access. She was on a life-altering journey of her own, but I think like many high schoolers, I had finished, and my desire was to get the heck out of Dodge and never come back. And naively thought I could escape the brambled racial borderland of my youth. Of course, that just followed me everywhere I went. And by the time I left, there's nothing like leaving to make you realize and appreciate what you just left behind. And I probably traumatized my parents all over again, because I went to Princeton University and finished and said, I'm not taking a job, I'm not going to grad school, I'm coming home. And my plan is to like walk the earth, hang out with my elders. And they were like, well, good luck with that, because we're done paying for everything. I ended up spending time with this guy named Archie Mosé, who was born in 1901. He was about 12 the first time he even saw a white man. He was in his 30s the first time he saw a black man, or a car. When I met him, he was sitting in a modern little house watching WWF SummerSlam on a TV, laughing very loud. And he could speak English, but not that well. And I came in and he said, oh, I've been waiting for you. And I thought, what? You don't even know who I am. But he had a dream, and I looked like whoever he saw in his dream, and he just kind of flung his life open for me. I ended up living on his couch. I was his gopher, go for this, go for that, drive him here, drive him there, fill pipes, haul drums. And I remember driving him to the bank, and he had a little check because he used to drive truck for the county highway department later in his life. And he couldn't endorse his check. He never finished second grade. He's one of the best educated people I've ever met. And so I had an immersive experience with our language and our culture. And it has been really exciting and heartening for me in my personal life to think about, what does healing look like? How could we restore the intergenerational transmission of our culture and our language and our wellness and our dignity and our longevity? And so kind of feel like Forrest Gump. After that, everywhere I went, I was running. I never thought it would take me anywhere, but it kind of did. Of course, I ran out of money. My parents were right about that part. I took a job. I eventually went to grad school, and I pursued a career in academia. At the same time, I followed Archie everywhere I could. Of course, he was quite old, and he didn't live forever. And when he did pass, I ended up inheriting a lot of his work, serving our communities, officiating at life ceremonies, funerals, working with our language and culture in many different ways. My firstborn daughter was lucky enough to have him for a namesake, and I just remember it's such a powerful experience becoming a parent. And all of a sudden, everything felt a lot more real. Like you got one shot at parenthood. Nobody ever has it figured out. If we'd had it figured out before we brought children into the world, no one would ever reproduce, you know? And so it's terrifying being a parent. And it was also exhilarating and powerful. I committed myself to speaking our language with her all the time, as much as I possibly could. And it has been really exciting watching her grow and change. So here she is a little bit through the years. She's now part of our publication team, transcribing elders and stuff. She does a lot of work with our language. We have some heroes. You know, right now I think there's an awareness that we're coming to a bottleneck period with regard to the number of species of animals on the planet, right? We are really doing damage to whole ecosystems. And that this is dangerous. It's kind of like we're playing Jenga with Mother Earth. Every time you pull a new block out and put it on the top of the tower, you destabilize the whole tower and you risk trophic cascade, as is happening in some of our oceanic ecosystems and some of our other ecosystems. In my part of northern Minnesota, we have a very complex ecosystem. 8 trophic levels, the whatever eats the whatever eats the whatever eats the whatever, and you pull out one Jenga block and everything starts going wonky. There's a lot to say about that. But a lot of people aren't quite as aware that we are also coming to a bottleneck with regard to human bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing, especially as they are embedded in our languages. There are 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. 2,500 are highly endangered, like count the number of speakers on a couple of hands. And they're all elders. There are only about 100 languages in the world that are actively and widely taught at colleges and universities. And we're really seeing 4 major world languages proliferating at the expense of many others. If it doesn't have economic value, we are enculturated to think it does not have value, period. That's not right. But we've seen, like a phoenix rising out of the ashes, some pretty heroic efforts to do something about that. In Hawaii, 30 years ago, their language was illegal for use in public schools. There were less than 1,000 speakers left. Half lived in one isolated island community, and the other half were all elders scattered across the rest of the islands. Today, there are about 24,000 speakers of Hawaiian, 3,000 of whom have learned it as their first language in the home. They've multiplied 3-fold the population of first speakers, 24-fold the population of speakers entirely. There are 22 Hawaiian medium schools. You can go to school K-12 and get your college degree, all taught exclusively in Hawaiian. And if you ask them, why do you do that? They say, well, it's not because Hawaiian is just another pretty bird singing in the forest. Of course, we appreciate all the pretty birds singing in the forest. But they talk about this word up here, maoli, which means spiritual fire. And they said, well-tended fires grow strong and neglected fires grow weak. For them, there are three sources of spiritual fire. The head is like a sacred vessel, housing for the soul. Pico is the belly button connection for them. They have a matrilineal tradition. And even here, kind of some of the petroglyphs, the ancient Hawaiian custom when a baby was born, and a little while later, about a week after they're born, the stub of the umbilical cord falls off the belly button, and they would actually go out to the lava beds and carve a divot and put the belly button there, and remember their spots, and then put the next one for their next kid, and the next one. And then when a girl grew up and became a mother, she would carve a circle around her divot, and then her babies went there. And it's pretty cool when you go out to the petroglyphs and see acres and acres of divots and circles, connecting people to their matrilineal line, to their Aina, they're part of the Mother Earth. And for them, head, pico, also genitals is like future generations, and we need to tend to the fires. It's impressive, and I know Hawaii, like warm weather makes people happier too, but in spite of all kinds of issues with oppression and, what's going on the top of Mauna Kea and things like that, I think there is something emerging that we can all learn from about what it looks like for humans to get along with one another, learn from one another. They've been renaming all the roads and towns, and they didn't have to fight over it like, let's call it Lake Calhoun forever, like we did here. They embraced that, and no one gets lost when you are trying to find Liliuokalani Boulevard or the Kamehameha Highway. In fact, it's something distinctive and special about the place that everybody, Hawaiian or not, can hold up. Here's my grandma, Luella, and the youngest of my children, Luella, this picture is about 10 years old. I know we have short time here together today, and so there's no way to exhaust a conversation like this, but really only to start one. So I wanted to mention a couple things. One is, I'm just happy to stay in touch with everyone. I'll be hanging out for a while when Convocation's entirely done, and I'll have some cards out. Feel free to email me, call me. I'll shamelessly sell a few books if you're interested, and happy to just be in touch about this and really anything else that's happening in your universe. For me, as we think about the problems that we're dealing with in the world, like the climate change, like what's happening with world languages, those languages embody unique worldviews and unique ways of solving problems. The colonial way of solving problems, to impose one language, culture, and way of doing things on everyone else, is about erasure. And typically uses violence to effect that erasure. Physical violence, but also psychological violence. If education is just about acculturating everybody and obliterating what is central to their identity, that's not a gift, it's a taking. That is confining, not liberating. When I went to school 13 years in a row, it started to bother me that none of it had anything to do with me. From good-hearted people, my teachers, who wanted to equip me for what they understood to be success. The message screaming at me through the absent narratives was that you and yours are not important, not relevant, and don't matter. And so I reacted like anybody does when they feel assaulted, right? When we feel assaulted, it's like fight, flight, freeze. And by the way, all the professionals are wondering, how come we got truancy issues with all these students of color? I'm like, flight? How come we got discipline issues with these students of color? I'm like, fight. How come they're like spaced out, zoned out, and hanging out at the Indian Ed office? I'm like, freeze. And it's not quite that simple, but there's a lot to unpack there too. The states that perform most highly in education at the K-12 level are Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, North Dakota, starting to see a pattern, with aggregate test data in mathematics and English. The states that do the worst with racially predictable disparities are the same states. The same ones. The whiter the state, the whiter the body of curriculum, the whiter the body of teachers who's doing the teaching, the better those white students are doing, and the worse everybody else is doing. But we cannot build education to be a colonial white empowerment program. We have to render it equitable. We have to make it so that all of us can learn about ourselves as well as the rest of the world. Me, I want my kids to know about the rest of the world. But I want them to know who they are too. And no one should have to sacrifice that so that they can have access to financial opportunity. No one should have to be emotionally traumatized to get that. And so, there were all kinds of surprises on my journey. One of my namesakes said, if you ever learn something, make sure you teach it to at least 4 other people. Whether that's a word in your language, a medicine, a teaching. It's something that I've tried to do throughout my life. I ended up working with a huge team of people in so many different ways. And that's one of the things I just love about our indigenous cultures, is that there's a expectation of communal and collaborative work, not just individual excellence. And by the way, as I was mentioning colonial culture, solving problems by using violence of any kind creates other problems. We're dealing with them now. It's not a surprise to me that those who are most steeped in the culture of colonization have the most damage from it. And even if you receive the most benefits in terms of financial and political power, it comes at a cost to our humanization. As an example, I am the first generation in my family that has not served in the US Army. So that includes all my uncles, cousins, my father, who came here at age 14 and then lied about his age to sign up for the US Army at age 17, hoping to kill Nazis, and got sent to the Pacific Theater. My grandfather, great-grandfather, and then all the way back to like Ojibwe Dakota Wars. And I have watched them win their wars and be deeply traumatized by the winning, because the violence dehumanizes all of us. Why would we think that all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? They cannot. And embedded in indigenous languages and cultures are more than vestigial remnants of some very different ways to solve problems. We have something to teach the rest of the world. We should be pollinating the garden that everyone else is trying to harvest from. But if we believe that human beings should and do have some kind of human rights, then you should understand that our languages are important in many other ways too. In the Language Warriors Manifesto, I lay out why the language revitalization is important for healing, for identity, for community, for a toolbox of problems to solve all the stuff that all of us are dealing with. One of the markers of a successful nation like this will not be our ability to obliterate the cultures and languages of everybody who has ever come here, but our ability to tolerate, support, and help to thrive all of the many different languages, cultures, and ways of thinking that have come here. No one's going to be a racial majority in this country for most of your lives. The majority of the K-12 students in America right now are students of color, and it doesn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, build a wall, don't build a wall, whatever happens, that's who's here. If America getting brown is like the sinking of the Titanic, you hit that iceberg ages ago. Rearrange the furniture all you want. If it feels a little sad that some of the marginalized cultures and groups have suffered different kinds of oppressions and exploitations, then consider what could happen to any one of us, no matter what group you're in. I'm not interested in transferring power from one group to another so much as I'm interested in transforming power. I think we got to quit fighting over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed. We should take all that energy and fight oppression. To engineer something better, healthier, that can actually work for all of us. There are a lot of things in the way, and most of these may be obvious to you. Money, support. By the way, as an Indigenous person, I do whiteness really well. If I want my kids to eat, man, that's the only way to get it. So you can read, W.E.B. Du Bois, and he talks about dual consciousness. Or James Baldwin, who expounded on those ideas with great eloquence. We have to code switch to operate in the rest of the world. And then at what point does all the code switching turn into assimilation and we lose ourselves? So I am very lucky in many different ways that I get to spend a lot of time in my Indigenous affinity space, officiating at ceremonies and living in the part of the world that I live in with a big family that really loves a lot of these same things. In the book too, I kind of lay out my own journey in more depth, and I talk about a collective journey which is ongoing, and I would still classify as emerging but quite powerful. Here is Rose Tainter saying we want an Ojibwe immersion school like those Hawaiians got. I'm on the school board for Wadukwadading now. They've been going for over 20 years. One of the things that surprised people the most, the reason that the Obama family wanted to come and meet the kids at the Ojibwe language immersion school is because about 50% of Native kids are not making it with regards to state mandated tests in English and math, but they were at the Ojibwe immersion school. Those kids are doing better academically, even with English, than the kids in the mainstream school. It seems counterintuitive. Like you want them to do English, you should be giving them more English. But the opposite is true. When you empower them to be exactly who they are, they're ready and excited to lean into everything we could possibly want to teach. And if anybody is figuring any of that stuff out, we should be paying more attention to that. So the Obamas came to the school, and the kids only spoke Ojibwe to them and sang them some songs in Ojibwe and said, "Thanks for coming." That's pretty cool. We've been pursuing bilingual signage efforts in Bemidji, so the Schools, university, hospitals, most of the businesses, regional event center. I even got it on the cop cars now. Ganawenjagang Minawa Nadamagang, to protect and serve. That, by the way, does not fix all the big problems. It just makes a little bit of safe space where we can start to talk about those bigger problems. Land acknowledgements are really healthy and positive, and we finally got ours going at the university now too. And that's just a starting place to make some space and create some visibility around a whole host of issues that we need to spend a lot more time and energy exploring. If you want a little more on the Ojibwe revitalization efforts, there's a free video called First Speakers, Restoring the Ojibwe Language. Won Emmy Awards and celebrated, often looping and playing on PBS or Twin Cities Public Television in the Twin Cities area, and easy enough to find. Just on Wednesday, I was in Mille Lacs, and we had a really exciting and also just like an emotional roller coaster ride with the elders in Mille Lacs over the past few years. So I came to a meeting about 3 years ago, and they said, "Hey, Dr. Treuer, do you want to look at our grants? We've got a little overage here, and we wanted to see what we could do around language." I said, "Well, how big's your overage?" They said, "Well, it's around $14 million. I said, "Oh, wow. Here's what you need to do." They had identified 25 fluent speakers left in the community of Mille Lacs. That was it, 25. I said, instead of just making them run to try to teach the kids, let's do Rosetta Stone. Let's make some Ojibwe books. Let's set them up to teach people for hundreds of years to come. And I laid out everything on my wish list that had been building for years. And they said, "Well, we're going to do it all." So year 1 of Rosetta Stone will be released this fall. They're going to be doing a year every year for the next 6 years. Be like 40 lessons per unit, times the 6 years. It'll push to an app on your phone. They can find their tribal members wherever they are on planet Earth and send the language to them instead of just require everyone to be physically present with 25 elders in their community. We started working on a bunch of kids' books. So this is some of the Jedi Council we assembled there. And initially, I was working as managing editor for the book part of the project, and we would assemble a team of about 50, and we'd pair up each one of the fluent speakers with a transcriber, and we would do storyboards and things together, break them out into teams, ran it through a whole program. And it was really exciting. And of course, the pandemic hit. We lost about 20% of our fluent speakers through the pandemic. And it's been pretty heartrending. And that includes in the community of Mille Lacs, so we buried several of these people. And then we had to do everything differently. So then we had to send a grandkid to each elder's house with a computer, flip it open and say, there's something called Zoom, I'm going to show this to you, and start trying to do work like that. And I caught Carol Nickelboy, she was one of the elders, and I said, "Hey, we got a story session today." And she said, "Oh, well, I got my coat on, I was going to head to the casino." "Well, the language is more important. Okay, let's do that." She takes her coat off. We worked for a couple hours. And then she said, "Well, I'm going to go to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in the car the whole time." So there was a lot of stuff like that. That was pretty fun. And at the publication celebration, they made 5 books through the pandemic. And we got the Minnesota Historical Society Press to publish them, even though most of the people on the staff can't read a word of it. It's a pretty remarkable partnership. Joe Naquinabe, he's one of the drum chiefs. He's kind of on the end, on this side there. He said, "I think working on these books was maybe the happiest time of my life." Which is a pretty awesome thing to hear, and pretty exciting to see. I'd say the future vitality of our language might not be certain in all places, but it is certainly possible with these kinds of efforts. I talked about our need for these things. We all need some healing. White people are busy colonizing each other before they took it to the rest of the world. We all need healing. And I believe that when we hold each other up, when we hold up the self-stated values of one another, when we preserve and revitalize and strengthen other bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing, that it will indeed make the world a better, healthier, happier place. We can't get to healed and skip all the healing. We can't get to reconciled and skip all the reconciling. There's a call in the shut up culture to have everybody be quiet and quit complaining because we're the greatest country on earth. There's one version of America that says it's land of the free and it's home of the brave. And look, when we started America, the definition of we the people only meant white male property owners. So most of us in this room were not included in we the people. But it was so beautiful that the polity could grow to the point where all of us in this room are part of the polity and actually can complain about our government and hope to be heard. So America's awesome. And there's another version that says that Constitution was created to enable the institution of slavery. All that talk about states' rights was so that some states could own black bodies if other ones objected to it. That Second Amendment to the Constitution, that's not about freedom. That was to enable the slave patrols to police black bodies, to strengthen the institution of slavery. Which version's true? And if we are to make an honest assessment of America, we have to say they both are. America has been built around the genocide of indigenous people, the theft of indigenous land, the enslavement and ownership of black bodies. We are still dealing with the fallout and living in a racial caste system. And at the same time, it is beautiful. And there is tremendous potential to render the experience of living here safer and equally safe for all of us, regardless of the color of our skin. We're not there yet, but it's possible to support and revitalize and help to thrive all of the many different languages and cultures and ways of solving problems that we would all benefit from having in this world. Healing is a two-way street. In the spring now, like when our children are born, there's something in our cultural toolbox where we will take the placenta, bring it home, and we actually, in my family, we bury it on the north side of a maple tree. The maple tree is considered the tree of life. And we put a little tobacco there and put the placentas there. And in the spring of every year, I bring my family out. I have 9 children. And they come out there and they tap the maple trees. And we harvest maple syrup and so forth, produce maple syrup and sugar. And so they're making offerings by these trees where their placentas are buried and taking life from the trees of life. And it's pretty cool now. My oldest daughter can officiate for the pipe ceremony in our language, to open up the sugar bush. All of my kids know the science, but also the art of how to get food out of a tree. And they walk around feeling like, I know something. And they do that with everything in our cultural toolbox. They're avid and excellent hunters, and because of these sorts of things, they can enter school and say, I know how to do stuff. Sign me up for AP. You know? It was pretty cool when I had my one of my middle kids was applying to colleges in the middle of the pandemic. He was, his whole world got shut down like everybody else, right, during his senior year. So that was prom, that was, show choir, all the kinds of stuff that he was into. And he was just kind of wrestling. I was thinking like, oh man, historical trauma, how's he gonna manage this stuff, And he had, his grandma, who he's really close to, died. That was my mom. My dad had died a few years before. There were lots of tragedies. His biological mother had descended into darkness, substance abuse. She was lost, and I thought, oh man, how do I protect him from all of this? How do I help him succeed? And I saved the essays he wrote. They're so powerful. And he just said, he was writing through there about, he was also really close with my dad, talking about the Holocaust, what happened with his, my mom and her family, grandmother, what happened with his mom, how sometimes he just felt angry, and sometimes he didn't feel anything at all. But he also said, but I know that there's a brighter future ahead. And all the trauma stops with me. And it was pretty exciting for me to see him find some strength out of the adversity. Of course, when he got into Dartmouth College, I was a big blubbering mess, hugging him and crying him. And I believe in our cultural toolbox, in our many different indigenous languages and cultures. For me, seeing what my kids do, just opening up the sugar bush, of course they were being shown and given a gift that they've internalized and taken ownership of, but that was so healing for me. Bringing my mom out there with us every year, trudging through the snow to sit there and watch her grandkids do this stuff, after she was dealing with her mom surviving residential boarding schools and not having access to some of these parts of the culture, that was healing for all of us. And healing the bonds between all of us. When any one of us does better, we all do. I like the Lila Watson quote, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together." Here's my crew. It's never dull. There we are tapping trees in the sugar bush. And that's a little bit about the Language Warriors Manifesto. Thank you so much for showing up for Convocation today and having me. Miigwech. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, I have a microphone and you have a question, so let's get together. Who's got first question today? Just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone right out to you, and here we go.
Carrie's going to get his workout in.
I saw a picture of your friend Archie with the Dalai Lama, and I'm wondering what that story is.
Oh yeah, it's actually a pretty fun one. So we actually took Archie to the National Conference on World Religions when it was in Chicago. And, Archie and the Dalai Lama kind of looked similar. Brown, glasses, bald. And the Dalai Lama really wanted to meet him because Archie is one of the oldest spiritual leaders who was there. And so he came up with a big line of monks, and they were bowing. And Archie had never seen anyone bow before. He didn't know what to do, so he started patting everybody on the head and saying, "That's okay, it's all right." And then in the Buddhist tradition, the head, kind of like the Hawaiians, is a sacred vessel, and it's taboo to touch the head. So the Dalai Lama stopped the line and he says, "Okay, how do you greet?" And he says, "I don't know. Hold up hands or shake hands." So he goes to shake his hand and he says, "No, like this." So they got kind of an arm wrestler handshake. Any others? We got time for maybe a couple more questions.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. When you showed the bilingual signage, I noticed that is it pronounced Ojibwe?
Yep.
It was written using the Latin alphabet. Was that something you had to develop in order to get it? The transcription, is that something you had to develop, or was that used previously, or can you tell us more about that?
Oh yeah, there's so much to the mechanics for a language revitalization effort. So for Ojibwe, we actually have a couple of writing systems. So one uses a syllabic orthography, so that's kind of unique to Algonquian languages. There's a symbol for each syllable in the language, and so when you look at that, you wouldn't recognize any of the symbols. But there's also what they call a Roman orthography, so basically using letters that are familiar to you to develop a writing system for Ojibwe. So initially, Ojibwe is an oral language, so it was, just used orally. We did have a system of writing on birch bark that used kind of mnemonic devices, so, a symbol for a deer or something like that, but it didn't equate to a written language per se, where the symbol would mean a certain sound in the language. But when the missionaries wanted to get in front of Native people, that's usually where a lot of the writing systems began. They wanted the Bible written down in front of people in a tribal language. So some of the early orthographies were developed that way. And then in the 1940s, the linguists started getting involved and developed what we call the double vowel writing system that we use now. So I do a lot of Ojibwe publication. Most of it's in the double vowel orthography. I do teach my students the syllabic system too, because it's part of our linguistic patrimony. But I do think it's useful to have a system, and any emerging language effort is going to run into some issues, and they'll include how do you deal with dialect variants, how do you deal with writing systems, where do you stand with technology, and those have to be negotiated, with empowered voice from all the communities that are developing the efforts. So there's kind of a spectrum. The Pueblos, for the most part, have been a little more conservative and have said, we don't want the rest of the world learning our language. We don't necessarily even want it in the schools. We want it in the Pueblo, and have been a little more resistant to embracing some of the technology and so forth. Some of the other ones, Hawaiian had a long literary tradition. They're publishing, newspapers and magazines. They haven't even exhausted all of it. Others like Ojibwe are emerging. When I was starting this, I'm 52 now, so I've been working on this stuff for a few decades. And there were just, a dozen books or something. There's so many hundreds now. There are even presses that compete who has the better list of Ojibwe books. Like, that's awesome. So it's growing, but you still need like 5,000 books loaded into an accelerated reader program tagged by grade level, so you can do full literacy development within your language. You're not going to do that overnight. So some tribes are resourced better than others. Muskogee Creek is another one. They're doing Rosetta Stone and other things. And I would say where I'm seeing some real strength would include, but not limited to, Mohawk, Cherokee, Blackfeet, Havasupai, Navajo, Ojibwe, Hawaiian, of course the Maori. And there are many others too that are really starting to get going. Lakota is getting going. Dakota is a little slower. There's a dialect variance there, but yeah. There's some really cool stuff we learned about how to navigate some of those differences. Go ahead.
We'll take one last question from back here.
Okay.
How did your exposure to your dad's Austrian Jewish culture affect, change, or enhance your appreciation of Native culture?
Oh man. I show up kind of brown and, beads, braids, or today it's a man bun, and lived in a Native space. So of course those things all impact how I look at myself and the kind of life I live, and then you've had a sense for some of my journey. But my dad lived a long life, and not only when I was a kid, but even throughout my adult life, we've been next door neighbors and amongst the best of friends. love him dearly. I love all the parts of me. And he would watch my kids, you know, and usually say, I'm going to punish you, and give them cookies for their punishment, you know. So they were all very close, and I thoroughly own and love that part of my identity too. I think he's a remarkable man, you know, in many different ways. He also had a real passion for languages. And I think after his experience with the Holocaust, it was just him, his parents, and 2 cousins who survived. Everyone else was killed in the camps. He could suffer no oppression. Like, you know, he worked as a labor union organizer, he worked as a teacher, he wrote and did journalism, and, you know, ended up advocating on a lot of environmental issues. He got a small piece of property for relatively little money. It had been taken into tax forfeiture, and he started to, it had been clear cut and turned into farm fields when he had it, and he started planting trees. And it totally transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. And so that's where I live now. I step out the door of my house and I walk in this forest of towering pine trees that he planted with his child labor force. And, you know, that'd be me. And it's very empowering. So, yes, you know, I think for all of us, like, we're all complex human beings, and I don't think we need to, you know, be ashamed of or marginalize or disown any part of who we are. It's hard enough just trying to figure out good answers to that question, you know, without making it harder for ourselves. So, yeah, so for me, yeah, he's a big part of who I am, not just in terms of my DNA.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr.
Thanks so
Treuer.
much for having me. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.